Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only Apologetics Satire podcast. I'm Will England, editor-in-chief of Rock Solid Apologia. Joining me today is Dr. Oz Guinness. Dr. Guinness is the author or editor of more than 35 books, including The Dust of Death, The Call, Fool's Talk, Carpe Diem Redeemed, The Magna Carta of Humanity, Last Call for Liberty, Impossible People, Unspeakable, and The Time for Truth. He is the founder of the Trinity Forum, a prominent social critic, and a frequent speaker who has addressed audiences worldwide. Guinness has a lifelong passion to make sense of our extraordinary modern world and stand between the worlds of scholarship and ordinary life, helping each to understand the other, particularly when advanced modern life touches on the profound issues of faith. A passionate advocate of freedom of religion and conscience for people of all faiths and none, he was the lead drafter for both Williamsburg Charter and the Global Charter of Conscience. He lives with his wife, Jenny, in the Washington, D.C. area. From the epic sarcasm of Tertullian to the funny retorts of Martin Luther, satire has been defending truth since the way, the truth, and the life himself became incarnate. We provide rock-solid Christian truth along with rock-solid apologetic satire, all on rocksolidapologia.com. Welcome to the world's one and only Apologetic Satire podcast, Dr. Guinness. It's fantastic to have you.
Thank you, Will. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
So if our listeners wanted to find some more of you, could you give a little bit of your background as well as where they can find you?
By all means, yes. I come from the Guinness family, well known for the Book of Records, and more importantly, for our family beer, which was founded by my great-great-great-grandfather in the 18th century. I'm descended from a part of the family that went out to China at the end of the 19th century. So my grandfather was one of the first Western doctors in China, and my parents were there too. My mother was a surgeon there, and I was born in China, spent my first 10 years there, so they overlapped with the climax of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. But my family is Anglo-Irish. I went back to school in England, university in England, London University and Oxford. And I worked for the BBC for a while after that. And since 1984, my wife and I have been here in the Washington, D.C. area.
And then if our listeners wanted to find more of you, do you have a website they should go to, some books you specifically want to point them to?
Yeah, ozguinness.com.
And then what was your most recent book out?
Now, my most recent is one for those who are seekers, because there's a tremendous dearth of meaning today and many people beginning to search all over again. It's called Signals of Transcendence, Listening to the Promptings of Life.
Do you feel like since COVID, people have been more interested in theological things or transcendent things since COVID?
Well, very definitely, but I think it's longer than that. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, you had the hardline atheists like Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins and so on, or Sam Harris. Now you're in the mood that I call wistful atheists or nostalgic atheists. So you have people like Tom Holland or Neil Ferguson or Douglas Murray who are actually very, very close to faith, because they realize in a very profound way that if the Christian faith goes, Western civilization goes too. And that makes a huge difference.
I've noticed, and maybe it's because I started paying attention because I was actually old enough about the time that COVID started rolling around, but people at school and people at church are a lot more interested, especially my age, in talking about theology and faith now than they were when I was younger.
You know, when I was your age, in the 60s, there was much more searching. I mean, you could hitchhike in those days safely. You go to a European crossroads in Switzerland, say, and you'd have half a dozen hitchhikers waiting for a lift. One would be reading Nietzsche. One would be reading Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. One would be reading C.S. Lewis. And the discussions would go on and on and on into the night as people grappled and wrestled with what's going on. There hasn't been a generation like that until maybe the current younger generation is somewhat in the same direction. So it's very encouraging. Because as you know, Will, the most famous saying outside the Bible, classical saying, is Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. Now, if Socrates is right, there are millions of Americans who are leading lives not worth living. They haven't cared enough or thought enough to think through the meaning of life. You go to a film, if you're plunged into the middle, you wonder, what on earth is it about? But many people are in the middle of life, and they've never actually asked what on earth it's about. Mark Twain used to say, there are two vital days in your life. First, the day you were born, and second, the day you discover why. Of course, that depends on if you do.
One of the interesting things I'm noticing is I go to public school, secular universities, and I'd be curious, this is not on script, but to see if you think this is a positive development or a bad development for culture. But my generation wants a cause. They're always looking for something to be part of, and they don't seem to be apathetic. They all agree that something's wrong. It just seems like they have maybe not the correct idea of how to fix it.
No, I think that's entirely to your credit and their credit. For me, as I said to you, I was there under the reign of terror in the Chinese Revolution. I have never been taken in by Marxism. If you look at the radical left, whether it's cultural Marxism or classical Marxism, communism, their revolutions never succeed, their oppressions never end, and the future that they promise never arrives. But despite all that, many young people still become Marxists. And obviously the reason is they give you a sense of belonging and a sense of purpose in a future, that classless society of egalitarian that never comes. The state never withers as they promised, but the idealism touches hearts and minds, and your generation, to their credit, they want to belong and they want to have purpose. And that's right. But the question is, which one?
So in your view, what's the best way? You're sitting in a class with a bunch of young people who are very optimistic generally about society, but they've got all these, they might object to it, but generally Marxist ideas, and they're pretty excited about it. What's the best way for our young Christians to stand for Christ in these university settings?
Well, you're raising a wonderful question, Will, that touches on the very heart of what your podcast is about, apologetics. And I think the first thing we do is love people and listen to them. So we ask questions to discover where they are in their life and in their journey, if they're on a journey at all in their minds. But the basic thing we're interested in as we love them and talk to them is, are they open or are they closed? Now, if they're open, then the gospel is good news because they're in a bad situation and they know they need it. But most people today, for various reasons, are not open, not interested, not needy. And many followers of Jesus, many Christians, make a very bad mistake by preaching to them as if people would immediately see it as good news. But if they're closed and not in a bad situation, it's not good news to them. It's upside down. So you've got to switch tactics at that point and raise questions to them. And above all, push them out. Take seriously what they say they believe. And since we know it's not true, you gently but firmly push them out to be true to it so that eventually their heads it against the wall. C.S. Lewis famously said, you push people to the absolute ruddy end, a very English way of putting it. Or Francis Schaeffer, the American apologist, he said, you point people to the logic of their assumptions, their presuppositions. So you take a biblical example. People are a bit skeptical of what I said sometimes. You take the prophet Elijah. And you remember, he has 850 false prophets against him. The people of Israel are sitting on the fence. They don't want to commit themselves to him. And the royal family, the whole royal court, is against him. So does he say, all right, Israel, come back to God or we're going to fall apart? No. He has the guts to say, if Baal is God, follow Baal. Now, why on earth can he say that? Because he knows Baal is not God. And as they try and prove that he is God when he isn't, they hit their heads against the wall and they come back to him. And we're doing our own equivalent to that today. In other words, raise questions. You say you believe this or that or the other. Okay. What would it mean in this situation? And where does it lead to in terms of that? Because the appeal, say, of Marxism, justice, equality, sounds terrific. But as you go down the line and see it works out, it's always worked out with serfdom and oppression.
And asking the question of late in my classes, you want a revolution, but how do you know that when you put the oppressed on top, that they won't become the oppressors next time around? Because that seems to be what happens in the revolutions of the left.
Well, understandably well. Put it like this. The left is postmodern. And as you know, the essence of postmodernism is the death of truth. And the only operating principle left is power. So what they do, and you can read their literature, they analyze how people speak in order to discover who's the majority, who's the minority, who's the oppressor, who's the victim. And when you discover the victim, a group rather than an individual, or an individual is a symbol of a group, then you set up a conflict of powers. But remember, no truth, only power. So the Romans understood this very well. The only possible peace is when you have a power so powerful, it can put down every other power. And that's what the Romans called the peace of despotism. In other words, you bring in the state and you end in with authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And that's where the left ends every time.
So I wanted to circle back and go a little bit into some of your work where you compare, and correct me if I'm off or I'm misrepresenting it or misunderstanding it, but the American and the English revolutions with the French, the Chinese, and the Russian revolutions.
Well, if you think there are 5 big modern revolutions, the English, 1642, the American, 1776, the French, 1789, the Russian, 1917, and the Chinese, I said I was there, 1949. The first 2, to many people, look different. The English failed. It's called the lost cause, whereas the American, of course, succeeded. But in fact, those 2 are very close, although one failed and one succeeded, and they're very different from the other 3. So the English and the American Revolution both had their roots not in the Enlightenment, but in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, what was called in the 17th century the Hebrew Republic. So notions like the consent of the governed comes in Exodus. Separation of powers is in Exodus. The notion of constitution comes from the notion of covenant, and so on. So those 2 revolutions are very similar, but the French, Russian, and Chinese are anti-religious, anti-Christian, and anti-biblical. And they're very, very different. And they end in completely different positions.
So when we're talking about revolutions, I think maybe 2 important questions that are even before that are, what defines revolution and what defines a successful revolution?
Well, very good question. The English and the American revolutions believed in the concept of revolution as it was rooted in the Bible. So you have, for example, in Acts 17, the agitators attack the Apostle Paul by saying, these men who've turned the world upside down have come here. And they were against Paul. Now, what was the biblical understanding of revolution? That God creates order, creation. Humans create disorder, sin, alienation, and so on. So God works into an upside-down, disordered world where things are the wrong way around to turn them the right way up. And so revolution from the biblical perspective is God's not overturning things so that they're different from before, but turning things so they're right way up as they should be. Now, of course, the Marxist revolution and anarchist revolution, they have entirely different views. So you've got to say, all right, revolution, yes, but whose definition? And with what goal and by what means? Because that's where the difference comes. I'm not against revolution. I think there is a Christian and a Jewish view of revolution. The Jews put it more, we're out to repair the world, restore the world that's gone wrong. And one day the Messiah will do so finally. But in the meantime, in the interim, we're doing our part, working for freedom, working for justice, helping the poor, and so on. So we should be, followers of Jesus should be, a revolutionary force in society, but defined in a biblical and a Jewish and Christian way, not the Marxist way.
So what would we see in a successful revolution? So specifically in the American Revolution, what did we see that made it successful versus what did we see in the French Revolution that made it not successful?
Well, take those quick notions, the notions I mentioned very quickly, the consent of the governed. 3 times in Exodus, when God proposes the covenant, it says the people respond, all that the Lord says, we will do. That's the origin of the consent of the governed. Or take another biblical notion that everyone has a reciprocal responsibility for everyone. So it said every Jew is responsible for every Jew. The 3 Musketeers, one for all for one. Or as it says in Leviticus, you love your neighbor as yourself. So there should be a solidarity. So when you say we the people, every American should be responsible for the American Republic. Now that's broken down. And so you can see if you unpack some of the simple biblical ideas, they are very profound and very radical and very timely.
So would it be fair to say that the American Revolution got most of their ideas from the Hebrew covenant as opposed to, say, Greece or Rome?
Oh, absolutely. At the time of the Revolution, historians say maybe 90% of Americans were from a Reformation background. So things like toleration and religious freedom and so on, they didn't come from the Enlightenment. They came from the 17th century and people like Roger Williams or William Penn and so on. So they owed a huge amount. Samuel Rutherford's notion of Rex Lex, the law is king, and so on. You can see that the what was called the Hebrew Republic, as I said, was incredibly important. So the Mayflower Compact is a covenant. John Winthrop on the Arbella is talking about a covenant. You know, when John Adams, the second president, wrote the first written constitution of the US, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, what did he call it? A covenant. And so the 18th century US Constitution is actually a nationalized, somewhat secularized form of Hebrew covenant. And so you don't understand America. It wasn't founded as a democracy. As you know, the American founders were very chary of democracy. As Plato and Aristotle pointed out from the beginning, democracy often is corrupted and ends in anarchy and mob rule. After all, Plato's great hero, Socrates, his mentor, was executed, not by oligarchs or a dictator, but by Democrats. And he was very chary of democracy, and so were the framers. Whereas today, I'm not American. But I find it odd that here, living in Washington, I've never heard anyone defend the republic at the highest level. President Biden talks about saving democracy. Even that is somewhat deceitful because he's really just trying to make a bid for power. But he says nothing about the republic, and I wonder if he knows the difference. So, President Trump talked about make America great again. President Biden talks about restoring the soul of America. But you notice, Will, neither of them say what made America great in the first place. It was a republic.
So in class, I hear, and I'd be curious to see your thoughts on this. Rome was the big thing for the founders, is what we're taught. Washington and Cincinnatus, architecture, slavery, etc. The Roman Republic versus the founders. How would you interact with those ideas who say, well, it was the Roman Republic more so than anything else?
Well, John Adams, for example, says that the Hebrew Republic did more to civilize the mankind than any other source. So you take the Roman Republic and its great spokesman, Cicero. How long did it last? Not very long. And it collapsed and was replaced by an imperial dictatorship. Rome does not give us a model of an enduring republic, whereas the Bible does. One of the notions behind the notion of covenant and therefore constitution is that there's a morally binding pledge. In other words, it's more than a legal contract. It depends on promise keeping. Now, the trouble is the Lord, God, keeps his promise, never breaks it, whereas we humans don't. Whether it's marriage or America, human promise keeping breaks down. So you have in the Bible a notion of renewal and rededication. Why? Because things often go wrong. So they've gone wrong today. People have forgotten. America needs a national service of rededication and renewal, rather like Ezra and Nehemiah and so on, because Americans have lost it. They've forgotten their promise keeping. So something like Colin Kaepernick, for instance, undermining the pledge, that's very radical, because Abraham Lincoln or Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King, they all believed in the Declaration. Martin Luther King said it was a promissory note. It promised freedom. It didn't deliver it, but it was a note that could be cashed in. But what Kaepernick and the people who rule out the pledge or standing for the flag or whatever, they are undermining a belief in the Declaration itself. So the Pledge of Allegiance shouldn't be an empty ceremony. It should be something very living from generation to generation. Covenants and constitution depend on promise keeping. Take the Robert Frost poem, Promises to Keep. America has promises to keep, and it's time for you to remind your generation.
So which founders would you say? I mean, I think most of them seem to understand it, at least at some level, but which founders seem to understand that the most? Which ones maybe were pushing back on this idea of covenant?
Historians often talk of the two foundings. In other words, the early settlers, the Pilgrims and so on, and then the revolutionary generation. For the first founding, there's no question that their model was covenant, and it was rooted in the notion of the Exodus. Now, by the 18th century, some of that had faded, no question. So people were following John Locke and his reliance on Cicero. But that was the lesser influence compared with most people who understood it in far more biblical terms. So John Adams, I said, is the Hebrew republic's done more to civilize people. Or James Madison, the father of the Constitution, a very huge chasm between the American and the French Revolution is over humanity. So the American Revolution, coming from the Bible, sees people as sinners capable of abusing power. So you need checks and balances, separation of power. The French Revolution is utopian. That's a huge difference. So Madison, Federalist 51, separation of powers and so on, all goes back to the teaching of John Witherspoon of Princeton and his insistence you have to have that. Government is a commentary on what we think of human nature. Humans are incredible in terms of their ideals, but awful in terms of the depths they can sink to. So you have to have separation of powers, because otherwise you have an abuse of power. And that's the problem with the left. You create a large, powerful state, and it ends in corruption and serfdom.
It's often ironic to me that the left seems to think, on one hand, that, I mean, they have a utopian view and they believe that man is inherently good. But on the other hand, they think the systems are inherently oppressive, which has always struck me as not really making sense.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of contradictions. Another very obvious one that's very important. Modern secularism, take the atheist, for example, is deterministic. It might be Karl Marx determined by economic forces, or Freud by unconscious drives, or Darwin and people like Crick and Watson by genetics. Most atheists are rigorously determinist, Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris. But at the same time, secularists believe in total freedom with only two possible limits: consent and do no harm. Now, there's a clash between that. The Bible gives you a basis for why people are free, humans are free. And without the biblical basis, modern people are stuck. There are all sorts of contradictions. Well, you're right, and you need to point them out. Get people to think about that.
So shifting to the super practical, I mean, we talked about the very, very ideological level. There's a practical side to all of this as well, about like, how do we live in our society today? And I mean, I suppose the first theoretical questions, it's not exactly as practical, but goes along generally, is I think we're generally looking for a more Christian society. And this is one of the interesting things I've run across is, why do the vast majority of us here in the United States live better in our seemingly secular society than those who lived in the Middle Ages, when the church had a huge influence and the European kings and rulers were predominantly Christian? When we're trying to have a more Christian society, are we trying to go more like the Middle Ages, more like the founders, more like Bible times? How do we navigate that?
Well, remember, as Nietzsche put it, there was only one true Christian, Jesus. In other words, every follower of Jesus is a sinner and falling short in one way or another. Now, the early church made a huge mistake. When Rome declared the Christian faith the official religion of Rome, 380 AD, the church copied Roman structures. Roman structures were hierarchical. You had a Caesar, dictator, consuls, senators, and the church had a pope and cardinals and bishops. And it was, the famous saying, all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That saying by Lord Acton was a Catholic layman, actually, in the context of the letter, he said that, critiquing his own church and the notion of papal infallibility. Because when you have hierarchical power, it is always based on power, and power not only oppresses the weak, power corrupts the powerful. So the church, copying Rome, corrupted itself. You think of the horrors of the Inquisition. just to mention one. Now, the Reformation said we not only go back to the Bible in terms of how we know God, justification by faith, we go back to the Bible for everything that we can find. What is the politics of the Bible? Is it monarchy, aristocracy, democracy? No, it's covenantal. And that's why the covenant and constitution are so important. They're a rejection of power-based politics. Now, of course, the modern world, you take China, you see the extreme of totalitarianism. But you look at the WEF, the World Economic Forum, Davos. They start with global problems like a pandemic or population or war. If you start with a global problem, you need a global solution and a global organization. And there's an inevitable drift towards global and the one world government that H.G. Wells and others predicted. Whereas in the Bible, you have the notion of local freedom, people living free, as George Washington quoted, under their own vine and fig tree, which is in the Psalms, in the prophets, and so on. In other words, you need freedom at the personal level, freedom at the local level, freedom at the national level, and at the global level, not just the global. So we've got to go back and really explore some of these things. The medieval church went badly wrong. And much of the rise of secularism is simply we don't want God if he's like the state church. So European secularism is a revulsion against corrupt, oppressive state churches in Europe. You know the cry of Diderot, the famous encyclopedist in France, we will never be free until we strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest. In other words, church and state, throne and altar were one, both corrupt, both oppressive, throw them out, both of them. So we're not going back to that. No, it's bad.
We're looking for a covenantal society, not a hierarchical society. And even though the Middle Ages put a Christian label on it, they were still a hierarchical society. And that was where they went off. Is that fair?
Yeah. Now, of course, there are organizations that require hierarchy. You can't run an army covenantally. You couldn't run an orchestra covenantally. The conductor conducts and everyone follows him. So there are some places where the hierarchical is right, but biblically not in politics. There should be an open forum in which everyone's free to enter and engage and play their own part as active citizens.
So let's talk a little bit more about how we engage with our society as a whole. I feel like especially non-Christians and people my age, I mean, they hear we want to reverse the culture. They hear, I mean, it's like you say, they're rebelling against the idea of church and state being combined. That's not what we're saying. But no, oh, good.
You think of the First Amendment. It shifts political discussion from coercion to persuasion. So take two things that happened in America. One, I think, very good, and the other very bad. One was the abolition of slavery. You know, my family, the Guinness family, we supported William Wilberforce and backed him financially and so on. He fought for nearly 50 years to see slavery abolished, but he persuaded, and then was able to pass the legislation that won the victory. Now, compare abolition, led by persuasion, ending in legislation. Compare that with prohibition. Now, coming from a brewing family, I'm not in favor of prohibition anyway. But you think they had the power in the early 20th century, so they just passed legislation without persuasion. And of course, it didn't work. You had a quick revolt and everything went back, and they were scorned for doing so. So we're called to be salt and light. We're not there to coerce people. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, Jesus said. And you know the famous painting by Holman Hunt, there's no handle on the outside of the door. In other words, both Jews and Christians believe in human freedom. And one place God will not invade: the human heart. So he invites and persuades, but people have to welcome him in and open the door. So never coercion, always in terms of faith, persuasion. That's the importance of religious freedom.
So how today should we respond when we have, it can seem as though we have a government that is coercive? How should a believer respond when the government either commands what is evil or prohibits what is good? What's the Christian response to living in that kind of a society?
Well, fortunately, in this country, with such a stress on freedom, you have the First Amendment. So the three foundational rights: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of speech and expression, and freedom of assembly and association, they are very, very important. They're being overridden more and more and being rebranded by the left as a matter of discrimination and bigotry. But we can still appeal to them while they're, in the law. Many countries don't have that. So we've got to fight for an open forum and respect, not only fight for our freedom of conscience, say, but for other people's too, and really enter into debate. So, when I talk, say, to the Democrats who talk about saving democracy, what do they mean? The most famous saying on democracy in America, I think, is Abraham Lincoln's, the Gettysburg Address: government of the people, by the people, for the people. Many people don't realize Lincoln was quoting. He was quoting a pastor who'd written on it 3 months earlier. Here's the important point: the pastor was quoting himself. And who is he quoting? John Wycliffe, the early Christian reformer. So in the 14th century, Wycliffe, who was the master of Balliol College in Oxford, Wycliffe was saying, to have government of the people, by the people, you need the Bible, so that people can achieve self-government because they know how to live rightly. They can have freedom with responsibility. And if you have the Bible out of the hands of the clergy and into the hands of ordinary people, it took a while before that happened under Tyndale, then you can have government of the people, by the people, for the people. We've lost the foundations today. So democracy, to many people in America, is simply mathematical thing, counting 51% and counting heads at the end of election day. That is not democracy. Real democracy depends on self-government, self-rule, starting with individuals.
So what can we as Christians do to help point society back in that direction? What's the best way as we practically go about life to work towards that?
Well, we admire and agree with the passion for freedom and with the passion for justice, to take two examples. But we point out that their views of it lead to disaster. And only with a biblical foundation can you have freedom that is rich and deep and justice that is rich and deep. So, I mentioned how the left deals with justice and the peace of despotism earlier. Compare that with the prophets, Amos, Micah, Hosea, Jeremiah, Isaiah. Unlike the postmoderns and the radicals, they addressed truth to power. It's not just a power game. Truth to power. One word of truth outweighs the entire world, Solzhenitsyn said. You will know the truth, said Jesus, and the truth will set you free. But then they called for repentance. The Greek word repentance, many people know, metanoia, an about turn of heart and mind. Now, the Hebrew word is even richer. It's an about turn of heart and mind, freely chosen, but it's a homecoming. And that's wonderful. People can choose to turn around and come back. And the third thing, of course, is forgiveness. Forgiveness is very radical if you think about it. It frees the past and it opens up a future of a second chance. That's incredibly radical. And freedom is closely linked to forgiveness and forgiveness to freedom. And that, of course, leads on to the fourth thing, reconciliation. And you could go on down the line. The biblical approach is so much more radical. And you literally turn enemies into friends and sinners into saints through the biblical way of tackling wrongs and injustice and so on.
And one of the key distinctions between the Christian way of going about it and the left's way of going about it is we have truth rather than just power.
Absolutely. And that's very important because you need truth to say why a lie is a lie and an abuse is abusive. In other words, for the negative part, because freedom, as Isaiah Berlin puts it, is always negative and positive. Negative freedom is freedom from. So people need to be freed. The Israel was freed from Pharaoh and slavery. Someone who's addicted or addicted to booze or to drugs or whatever, they need to be freed from anything that constrains them. That's negative freedom. But you need truth also for positive freedom. People need to be free to be who they are. But who are they? Are they animals? Are they machines? Or are they made in the image of God? So you need truth both for negative freedom and for positive freedom. And without truth, you cannot have freedom. It's as blunt as that. My wife always reminds me that the film The Titanic, which I'm sure many of your audience have seen. You know, the engineers is asked, do you think we're going to survive? He says, madam, when certain of the compartments were holed, it's a mathematical certainty. The ship is going down. And in the same way, it's a mathematical certainty. Without truth, there is only power. So might makes right. You cannot have freedom. And your generation needs to understand that.
And so the last question here on the plan, we talked about how we as individuals, what we as individuals do about the culture. What should the church, the capital C church in the United States, be doing at the moment?
Well, I don't think the church as church, in other words, the big institution, should play much of a part. But individuals are citizens and followers of Jesus are called to be salt and light, and each one of us should be deeply engaged in whatever level we're in. I love the very simple fact, what is leadership in the Bible? It's not just the person at the top, you know, a president or a general or a CEO. No, of course it is that. Leadership is people in their sphere at every level taking the initiative and the responsibility to do what needs to be done. And I love that. You know, my Jewish friends, one of their heroes in the Bible is Nahshon. A lot of people have never even noticed the name. If you read the Bible proper, I think he's Aaron's brother-in-law. He doesn't figure very much. But in Jewish tradition, he's very, very important because of the crossing of the Red Sea. The Lord said he was going to send a wind. Moses was to hold his staff up. And as the wind blew, the waters rolled back and slowly a path emerged. But people looked at it, looked incredibly threatening with those banks of water. Who's going to go in? No one wanted to. Nahshon strode out. And in Jewish tradition, if I got it right, the waters were up to his neck before they started to go down. And then he strode through and everyone followed him. And we need people who take the initiative and take the responsibility in every sphere at their level, speaking up, speaking out, acting, whatever it is. Every American is responsible for the American Republic. Christians who duck out, it's a failure of discipleship as well as citizenship.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I feel like Christians are very good about talking about theological issues, but we're not necessarily as good at dealing with political or cultural issues in an intellectual sort of way.
Well, I think you're right. And that's a great mistake because the Bible has so much to say about the whole of life. And certainly today, people say we're in an age of superabundance and incredible technological advances. And yet the problems are in politics and culture and rooted in morals and faith. And so we got to see how all these things tie together. I would say, I hope there's an awakening of the church in the West, so it plays a strong part again. But look in the future, your generation. How are we going to have a human-friendly future? Not through authoritarianism, not through totalitarianism. But you look in the Bible, the highest view of human dignity, made in the image of God, the highest view of truth, the highest view of words and freedom and justice and covenant and peace, going down the line. Every one of these crucial political and cultural things is there in the Bible. So we've got to explore it and dig it out and live it out again today and show the way forward so that humanity can go forward to a human-friendly future rather than the dark world that the radical left is leading us to. Great to be with you, Will. Thank you for having me.
Well, it was great to have you. I really appreciate your books and a lot of your writing. And I think that wraps up the latest edition of the world's one and only Apologetics Satire podcast. We want to thank Dr. Oz Guinness again so much for joining us. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia podcast.